What's up, YouTube? Hope everybody is having an awesome afternoon. Some exciting news. Played in an RCQ yesterday and ended up splitting the finals with Dimir FrogTide. Got one of these fancy little top 8 pins as well. Ended up giving the invite to the other player. Local great player. Really excited to get to compete with them more in the future. But since I'm already queued for Charlotte in March, I'd rather get some invites out there, find some more people to potentially travel with in the future. So always good to help build the community that way. But I thought I would come on here and do a little bit of a deck tech, do a discussion on some of the card choices, talk about some changes I'll be making to the deck, go over some popular matchups right now, because I figure if you're clicking on the link, you're probably thinking about playing FrogTide, or maybe it's on your radar as a deck you wanna pick up, and you're looking for a little hot take here or there. So maybe you can plan for your next RCQ and hopefully take that one down as well. So maybe I'll see you in Charlotte. But anyway, let's get on to the deck. I got my nice little display image down below so we can move around, talk about some of these cards, and we'll know exactly what we're referring to at all times. So that'll be exciting. But Dimir FrogTide, if you have played Modern any time in the last, I don't know, like since MH3, you have probably run into this deck a time or two. Whether that be good or bad for you depends on what you're playing, what you're used to. But it is a very, very powerful deck that I think you need to be aware of the ins and outs of. It is what people would consider like a tempo strategy. Cheap, efficient removal, cheap, efficient creatures, things like that, to kind of try to leverage a mana advantage against your opponent. Free spells like Force of Negation, Spell Pierce, and Spell Snare to potentially trade up on mana. Psychic Frog that can potentially outgrow a lot of things that your opponent has got going on. So let's go through the deck tech first. We'll go like left to right, go through all the card choices, and then we'll get into a dive. As I get to cards, I'll talk about whether or not I'm swapping them out or why that card is what it is. So the mana base, pretty straightforward. I did choose the 3 basic islands over the 3rd Dark Slick Shores. There was a lot of times that I was getting to turn 4 and I'd want to like play out a Psychic Frog, hold up Counterspell, or play out a Murktide, hold up Counterspell. And I'm sitting there top decking a Dark Slick Shores and just thinking, this feels awful. Really good chance that these Dark Slick Shores, for me at least, get replaced by the new Duskmourn land. I have no idea what its name is, but it comes into play untapped, taps for a blue mana, and then if you control an island or a swamp, it can tap for blue or black. So it is worse than Dark Slick Shores on turn 1 if you've got like a fatal push. But I think after turn 1 with Undercity Sewers, Watery Graves, Basic Islands, you have such a good chance of it just being like a free dual land. It's not tutorable, but being able to come into play untapped after turn 3 is a really big deal. And I think the downside of not producing both color mana on turn 1 is something that you can overcome very easily simply by the fact that you're not a deck that traditionally functions on 1 mana anyway, so you're not likely to keep 1 land hands. And if you do, you can still cast Preordained, Spell Pierce, Spell Snare off of it. So it's not the end of the world if you lead on that land. Just can't Fatal Push or Cling to Dust. I've got the full 4 Polluted Delta, along with 2 Bloodstained Mire, 2 Scalding Tarn. the Bloodstained Mire, because we have the basic swamp in here. I know it doesn't look like a swamp on the top part of the image, but we do have a basic swamp in here. And it's for our copies of Harbinger of the Seas. One in the main, one in the sideboard. The basic swamp's been up for debate. A lot of people not a fan of it, even if you're running Harbinger, kind of saying like you can go mono blue, which I don't disagree with. But I do think, at least on a local level, Boros is extremely prevalent, and there's a large number of times that you just can't counter the Blood Moon. So I think having access to the basic swamp for me has been really, really nice, along with like that third basic island. Little more likely to see your basics. It does hurt for Archmage's Charm. I did have a game in the semifinals yesterday where I was up against Goryo's, and I had an Archmage's Charm and a counter spell in hand with 5 lands, one of which was the basic swamp. So I couldn't double spell Archmage's Charm and counter spell. If you view that as enough of a reason to cut Archmage's Charm, I don't fault you at all. If you did want to cut the Archmage's Charm, if you thought the triple blue with the basic swamp was too risky, I would probably consider replacing it with another copy of Force of Negation and maybe a Consider. I've seen a couple of people going up to like 2 main deck copies of Tamiyo in the last couple of days. Don't hate that idea, but just something a little less mana intensive than Charm. The 2 Undercity Sewers, pretty stock. 3 Watery Graves. I've seen 3. I've seen 4. I think 3 is fine. More often than not, you're kind of getting that first Undercity Sewers. And then a lot of the times, unless you just have nothing to do and don't want to fetch your island or have a bunch of black cards that you're holding up, you're probably just getting basic islands after that a lot of the time. So these Watery Graves kind of go unfetched a good bit. 2 Sink into Stupor, the last kind of land slot. You do use the spell side a reasonable amount of the time, but I like considering them to be lands since you have that option available to you. In the 1-drop slot, or I guess in this it's more of like the utility slot. I don't really have things divided that well. We've got 2 Consigned to Memory. It's a card that I do think has live targets against most everything in the format. The Mirror is probably the one it's the least useful against, but against like Boros Energy or Mardu, hitting Static Prison ETB, hitting Amped Raptor, a Johnny, into turn trigger off an Ocelot Pride, a little less so. The Chain to the Rocks hits the One Ring, hits Flage, ETB, whole lot of stuff that Consign hits. Now, it's not going to feel great hitting those things, or it's not going to feel great hitting most of them. Hitting a Raptor is pretty fun. Hitting a Chain to the Rocks and a Static Prison is great, but like hitting in a Johnny ETB, not the most exciting. I've had some random turns where like I got to hit I guess turn 1 they played a Surveil Land, turn 2 Guide of Souls, play an Ocelot Pride, got to consign the Guide of Souls trigger so that they didn't gain life, didn't make a token into turn. I got to untap, just like play a Bowmaster, kill off the Ocelot Pride and kind of slow things down. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about matchups as soon as we get through the deck or deck tech. But just important to know, Consign has got live targets against most everything. It's obviously good against Tron for the colorless reasons and the cast triggers. Goryo's Vengeance, not as many targets. Like, again, I'll go into more detail later. Really big theory about Goryo's Vengeance, like countering the Atraxa ETB ability is just like not a winning line. 4 copies of Preordain is kind of our functional draw spell. Help filter through some of those early turns. 2 spell pierce, 3 spell snare. I think pierce has been really, really good for me for letting me interact with things like goblin bombardment on the draw a little more consistently, for casting a frog or a Murktide or something on like turn 3 or 4 and still holding up interaction, for a 1 mana answer to the One Ring on curve or Blood Moon, things like that. Just gives you a little more flexibility with some of those early turns. 1 Cling to Dust, great answer to Flage, great answer to Goryo's Vengeance. And I seem to see it in like every opening hand, which is hilarious. 4 Fatal Push, your premier black removal spell. For the creatures, we'll go bottom to top. So 1 Tamiyo. This was the 4th Murktide Regent, but I kept finding myself flooded on Murktides, so I wanted to replace it with something a little more proactive. It was originally the 2nd Harbinger in the main. I moved the 2nd Harbinger to the side because it feels like more and more people are aggressively playing around Harbinger, even if you don't have it. And Harbinger is a card that gets exponentially worse when that gotcha factor is kind of taken out of the equation. So I wanted something that I could play out more proactively, give some sort of an advantage. Yesterday, I think I cast Tamiyo like 3 times. The first time was against Mardu Energy. They fatal pushed it right away. Happens. Second time was in top 8 against a 4-color Omnath player, who I did get one. The first game, I got a clue token, went to like double preordain on my turn, and they evoked a Solitude to get rid of it. But again, like Tamiyo made or drew a card and got rid of a Solitude plus some other white card, like a Supreme Verdict or something. And then in game 2, they Galvanic discharged it like right away. That was all the times I saw Tamiyo, but I've always loved the card in Shadow. I do think it's a really good card for some of the unfair matchups where they're not interacting with it. Get to flip it pretty proactively with preordained frog hits, things like that, and then start rebuying counter spells or just go for the ultimate. The 3 copies of Murktide, like I said, I've been getting multiple stuck in hand a lot. Decided to drop from 4 to 3. Where I'm also not on a variation with like Considers or Thought Scours. So your graveyard isn't always up to par for an 8/8 Murktide. You usually get there, but there's a reasonable amount of times that you're just playing it out as like a 6/6 or a 7/7. Still really good, but you're not just powering through Murktides like some of the other builds. For Psychic Frog, Psychic Frog is hands down the reason to play the deck. I'm not as big of a fan of Psychic Frog in like the Shadow Shells because you're usually burning through cards aggressively. You're thought seizing over and over again. You're interacting 1 for 1. You're playing out these cheap threats. And you just have nothing left over for Psychic Frog. Psychic Frog in this deck, however, is phenomenal. Like, Psychic Frog, I know Mengucci talks about it all the time. Psychic Frog plus Force Negation is the new Splinter Twin and feels unbeatable so much. But it's true. Like, Psychic Frog on turn 2 won me more games than I can count against such a variety of decks. Like, Psychic Frog on 2 and your opponent goes Flage, target your frog. Cool, ditch 2 things, I win the game. You didn't answer the frog. Now I know you don't have an answer to frog, so I'm just going to start drawing extra cards. Take over that way. Psychic Frog into your opponent playing like Surveil Land Pass. Cool, won the game. You didn't deal with the frog. I'm going to draw extra cards, protect the frog. I do feel like I have gotten substantially better over the last couple of weeks, really, at managing the game with Psychic Frog. I used to be really bad about like oh, you get this frog, I want to start throwing stuff into it immediately. These cards might be dead. I need to get rid of them, start hitting with the frog. And now I feel a lot more comfortable with, okay, I'm going to hit you for one, like 4 times, and just draw some extra cards, make sure I hit my land drops, because eventually, as long as I'm good about filtering my draws, things like fetching up an Undercity Sewers before I attack with the frog, try to maximize my chances of hitting live, preordained to filter before I attack with the frog, things like that. I feel like I can do a really good job of making sure I've got one more piece of interaction than you have things you can do, and eventually you'll miss. And if I can keep filtering or keep drawing an extra card a turn, eventually when you miss, I'll be able to take advantage of that by laying out a Murktide or having like a Harbinger to lock up the game, whatever the case may be, second frog and just run away with it. 4 copies of Orcish Bowmaster. I would argue that Orcish Bowmaster will take Tamiyo out of the equation. I think Orcish Bowmaster is the weakest creature in the deck, and quite possibly the weakest card in the deck. Which feels really weird to say, because like Bowmaster is a really good card, but against a lot of the One Ring decks, you get down to Bowmaster and they just kind of answer it. They've got discharges and static prisons and whatever removal spell under the sun, or they can just tank a couple Bowmaster triggers and not really care, because like they're gaining a bunch of life. But especially in the mirror, I think people really overvalue Bowmaster. They're like, oh, it's a flash thread into a deck that draws cards with like Psychic Frog and Preordain and whatnot. And more often than not, I just find Bowmaster not mattering. I'll get into a hot take when we get to go over the Boros Energy matchup. But I used to think, and I still think it's better in Shadow in the Boros Energy matchup. But in Demir, I would almost argue that I do not think Bowmaster is good anymore, even with them going up on copies of the One Ring, which I know sounds blasphemous, but we'll go over it. 1 Harbinger of the Seas, like I said, was on 2, but I found more and more I'm playing against like Boros, and they're just aggressively fetching out basic mountain early. And if they have the mountain, then Harbinger doesn't really matter. Occasionally, you can snag free wins when somebody just doesn't respect it, doesn't play around it. More often than not, I've found I do not want to cast Harbinger on turn 3. That's probably common sense to a lot of people. Like, oh, your opponent's got an untapped fetch. Don't play out the Harbinger and let them just fetch around it. Because if you don't play it, they're probably going to go get a Surveil land and you have a better chance of locking them out later. But it is kind of a mindset change I've really had to get used to. And then not playing out Harbinger if I can't protect the Harbinger against a lot of decks. Like you're playing up against Boros and they have a basic Plains. They don't have any red, but they've got a basic Plains. Now if I play out the Harbinger and pass, I run the risk of them static prisoning or chained to the rocks. Not chained to the rocks. They don't have a mountain. Static prison. And I need to be able to have Force Negation active. Or I need to Harbinger on a turn that I can double it up with a counter spell or something. Consigned to memory. So you just have to be really careful about playing out Harbinger. Making sure that like when you cast it, if it can be, it's ending the game on the spot. Just like locking your opponent out of playing Magic. 2 Force Negation. Probably want access to the 3rd. I think the card does really overperform with Psychic Frog. 2 Archmage's Charm. I really like Charm. I think it's a great way to find a way back in when you're behind. Card advantage outside of Psychic Frog is not something that Demir really has access to. Doesn't have access to it in good forms. You can just like jam 4 copies of the One Ring and call it a day, but out of principle, I refuse to play that card, so be it. But Archmage's Charm, nice little way to just get like a little card advantage in there. Extra counter spell if you need it. You don't really steal much. I did win a game in the Trophy League we posted a couple days ago with stealing an Aether Vial from my Merfolk opponent and got to vial in a frog. That was really sweet. Not a common play. To go for the throat. This should just be Shoot the Sheriff. I could not find any on site. So go for the throat should 100% just be Shoot the Sheriff. The only 2 relevant creatures that go for the throat or Shoot the Sheriff misses are Ragavan and Dauthi Voidwalker. Dauthi kind of died out with Scam dying out, and Ragavan you're kind of great against anyway. You've got 4 Fatal Push, you got 4 Bowmasters. Tameo can stand in front of it. Psychic Frog stands in front of it. So really not worried about those. And then 4 Counterspell, like the backbone of any blue X control deck in Modern. And I would argue that we are a control deck. You can say tempo, and I think get away with that argument fairly reasonably. But there are very few matchups in Modern that we're not playing the control role. Even against some of the control decks, we probably have more counter spells. So, cards I'm not playing, Subtlety. I don't like Subtlety. I hate the idea of like turn 1 or 2 playing Subtlety to bounce something that wasn't really impacting the game. Late game, you'll have those times where your opponent goes to cast something and you're like, oh, I'm going to flash in my Subtlety and bounce it. But if that Subtlety is just a counter spell instead, like an Archmage's Charm or extra Spell Snare or something, then you just get to deal with that thing permanently. I hear the argument of subtletying an Escaped Flage all the time. And I think that that is not how the matchup goes. Especially post-board. Like, I don't feel like I ever lose that matchup to Flage. I lose to the One Ring all the time. And I lose to turn 1 Guide into like turn 2 Raptor into a Johnny into turn 3 Blood Moon. And maybe you want to argue Subtlety, the turn 2 Raptor helps. Sure. But I don't feel like I'm losing that matchup to Flage. So I don't really care for that argument. Sideboard, extra copy of Harbinger of the Seas. Just any of the aggressive mana decks. Like Zoo, sometimes you can catch them napping. The 4-color Omnath opponent I played in top 8. Decks with like Urza's Saga, really good answer to those. 2 Mystical Disputes, mostly for the Demir Mirror. Also really good against like Goryo's Vengeance. 2 Stern Scolding, any creature combo deck. Boros. Consign to Memory, and 3 Break the Ice, almost exclusively for Tron or any of the Eldrazi variants. 2 Toxic Deluge, any go wide creatures. 2 Surgical. Toxic Deluge. Zoo is becoming extremely popular. You can board in Toxic Deluge to take out a Scion with a Leyline out. There's your tip for the day. Does it feel great? Probably not. Does it kill the Scion? Probably. 2 Surgical Extraction, and Unlicensed Hearse, and a Nihil Spellbomb for most of my graveyard hate. I bring in the Surgical in 2 occasions. One, if my opponent is on a deck that relies around something in the graveyard. So against like Goryo's Vengeance, against decks like Dredge, against Crabvine, any of those things. Storm if I can hit a couple targets. And 2, if my opponent is playing a deck that I know has got like 8 or so things that I can't deal with. And I just need to try to get some amount of those off the table. So I will bring in Surgical against like Boros Energy a lot of the times because they've got 4 Flage and 4 One Rings. And even though I don't feel like I lose to Flage, if I can take that out of the equation and just focus on the 4 One Rings, then I feel like that frees up my counter magic a really good bit going into the mid to late game. Even better if I can counter like that first ring and then Surgical the rings and never have to worry about that again. Probably not using it on like a Goblin Bombardment, but the ring and Flage, ring especially. So decks like Tron, really difficult to deal with 4 copies of the ring and 4 copies of something like Through the Breach or Devourer of Destiny. Honestly, like the cast trigger off that, dealing with a Frog or a Murktide's pretty annoying. So taking out one of those can be relevant. Let's go through some of the popular matchups. I think that'll help people a lot more to kind of visualize why you should at least consider playing this deck at your next RCQ. We'll hit like the top, I don't know, 5 or 6 or something on Goldfish. The energy decks, Boros and Mardu. I do think Mardu is way better of a matchup for us than Boros. The 2 primary reasons being, like I said, for the mirror, Orcish Bowmaster is annoying. It's not that impactful, though, so a lot of times you can ignore it. And Mardu does not play Blood Moon at all or as many copies of the One Ring. So, like, the cards that are most likely to beat us, they've cut back on. Instead, they're playing, like, Chthonian Nightmare, Fatal Push, Thoughtseize, kind of those 1-for-1 trade cards that are meh. So the more a deck is playing 1-for-1 against us, the better we feel. The more they're playing 2-for-1s or like lockout pieces, the worse we feel. So definitely much better against Mardu than against Boros. Either of them, we're the control deck. You're just trying to kind of survive until you can land a Frog plus a counter or Frog Force, land a big Murktide. It used to be that you just slam a big Murktide and there's not a lot of ways they can deal with it. Galvanic Discharge, probably limited on the damage by a good amount. But now, since they're all running like 4 static prisons in the 75, it can be a lot more annoying to just like jam a threat. Harbinger, way better against Mardu than against Boros. But I do think it's like worth keeping one in against either one just for the chance of cheesing out a win. But I don't think it's great. I can absolutely understand siding out the Harbinger on the draw against Boros and maybe bringing one back in on the play. Spell Pierce, great against hitting, I think I mentioned earlier, like the One Ring on curve, hitting the Goblin Bombardments. Sometimes you can, like, turn 3, hit a static prison. Not a lot of great things as far as the cheap interaction goes, but some of the payoffs, Chthonian Nightmare, Bombardment, One Ring, Blood Moon, hitting those on curve, really, really nice. Consign to Memory, I'm boarding out pretty aggressively. I know it does hit some of the ETB abilities, but I think post-board you just have better answers with like Stern Scolding, Toxic Deluge. And then I talked about Bowmaster, how I don't think it's really that good in the energy matchup. Couple reasons. One, you're bringing in Toxic Deluge. So like you're bringing in your sweeper effect. So having a bunch of cards in your deck that die to your own sweeper is kind of mid. 2, a lot of the cards that cause you problems post board don't care about Bowmaster. So Guide of Souls, a Johnny, Static Prison, Chained to the Rocks, Blood Moon, the One Ring, Flage to an extent, Obnixilis. Yeah, just like none of those care about Orcish Bowmaster. The body off of Amped Raptor doesn't really matter. Usually standing in front of that pretty well or sweeping it. Ocelot Pride can be annoying, but you're probably going to deluge those away at some point or try to counter them proactively. If you're going to leave in some number of Bowmaster, I would leave them in on the play rather than on the draw, because turn 2 Bowmaster, your turn 1 Ocelot Pride isn't the worst, though more often than not you're holding up mana that turn, letting them hit you, keep from falling further behind, keep up like the counter spell or the Stern Scolding, Spell Snare, whatever for their 2-drop. Archmage's Charm can be a little awkward, because especially if they're heavy on Blood Moon, then you maybe can get your basic or a couple basic islands in your basic swamp. You're probably not getting all 3 basic islands in a basic swamp, so Archmage's Charm can just be dead through Blood Moon. In the sideboard, Stern Scoldings are great, Deluge great. Like I said, against Boros, I'll bring in Surgical Extractions because of 4 One Ring and Flage, and usually like a bunch of Goblin Bombardment. Against Mardu, I'm probably just bringing in Hearse and Spellbomb. That way I have an answer to Flage, have an answer to Chthonian Nightmare. Yeah, that's about it for the Mardu matchup. If you're coming from Shadow like I was, you really have to get used to the mindset of like, I don't have to get Undercity Sewers Watery Grave early. I can fetch up basics very proactively. Like I can just start the game basic island, basic island. If I got a Psychic Frog in hand, then maybe I'll start Undercity Sewers basic island. But a basic 99% of the time is in my first 2 fetches. So that way, even if they have a Blood Moon, at least I have a chance. It's the next matchup. The Murktide Mirror. I don't see a lot of Murktide in paper. See a ton of energy, ton of Tron, at least locally. But don't see a lot of Murktide. And I think for some number of people, it's like this this fear factor of playing a reactive deck in like a Boros Tron meta. I don't think those matchups are that bad. Like Boros is bad, but I don't think it's unwinnable. Eldrazi, I think if you're like going into it with a plan, and we'll talk about the plan, then I definitely think you can win that matchup. But the Demir Mirror, Bowmaster, I still think like extraordinarily overrated. Psychic Frog, don't play out your Psychic Frogs into just like a tempo spell snare. So if you're on the play and you go land pass, your opponent goes land pass, and you go land, slam a Psychic Frog, there's such a good chance that they're just going to have like spell snare or push for your frog, untap, play their own frog, and now you have to react on your turn, which opens up force negation on their turn, or force negation for them on your turn. And then you run the risk of like them forcing your removal spell, untapping, hitting with a frog, drawing cards, and like now they've got all their mana open, they've got a live frog, they're in the driver's seat. Instead, just like pass back, see if you can get them to make the first move and kind of reverse, hit them with the Uno reverse card. But this is definitely a matchup where like Archmage's Charm is extremely nice. Give you a little extra card advantage compared to some of the stock lists. Tamiyo is like S tier in the Murktide Mirror. Just really good at generating clues that you can crack later. And they really don't want to waste like a Fatal Push on Tamiyo, because your removal light uses a Fatal Push on Tamiyo, you risk getting run over by like the frog later. Yeah. Hopefully nobody heard that rasp. Post board. Oh, make sure you hit your land drops. So if you need to like just fire off a preordain or cling to dust something, do it. Hit your land drops. If usually in my experience, the winner is the person that can start double spelling first. So play out a threat, protect it with a counter spell, or end of your turn, like flash in Bowmaster, counter your counter for Bowmaster. Spell Snares, like best card in the matchup by a mile. It hits Psychic Frog, Bowmaster, counter spell, go for the throat, or shoot the Sheriff, which are like your only answers to Murktide Regent. And then post board, getting to bring in Mystical Dispute is like the best way to fight opposing spell snares. Because now it's, oh, you played into my Mystical Dispute, I dispute it. I'm more mana efficient than Counterspell, and I can't be spell snared. So really, really nice one up in the mirror. Stern Scolding always comes in. Hit Frog, hit Bowmaster. Hearse and Spellbomb are coming in. Please don't bring in Surgical Extraction in the mirror. Like, it's just a waste of card. There's this whole theory about like Surgical Extraction being good against threat light decks because it's, oh, you only have 11 things or so that are actually going to attack me. So if I surgical 4 of them, I just traded 1 card for your 4 things. And the problem is, like, from a card advantage standpoint, that just doesn't pan out because first off, you don't know that they're going to draw another Psychic Frog or whatever. Like, you killed one, you countered one, whatever. Now you're down a card for something that could have happened. Maybe it didn't. But now it's definitely not going to happen because you surgical, whatever. So you've just like gone down an answer to a future Bowmaster or Murktide or Tamiyo or whatever because you played a card to get rid of something that wasn't a threat anymore to prevent them from getting more copies of something that might not even have been drawn. If that makes any sense. But Hearse especially. Hearse is like a chef's kiss card in the matchup. Being able to stop Murktide from coming down almost altogether. Being a very troublesome permanent for your opponents to deal with. Locking up the yard, often preventing flying from the frog. Yeah, just find a Hearse. Make your life easy. But Mystical Dispute, I think, is just like the mirror breaker. Whoever's running more Mystical Disputes is probably going to win the counter wars. You win the counter wars, and it becomes a removal war. And the removal is just very sus, especially when it comes to Murktide region itself. Jeskai control. I wish I could say, like, I'm just skipping the Jeskai control part, because honestly, I never see Jeskai control either. Maybe there's like one person in the room that's playing it, and honestly, props to them for sticking through the pain. They're stronger mentally than I. Consigns pretty good. Stops like Solitude ETBs if they're running that. Stops One Ring. Stops Flage ETBs for whatever it matters. Stops the One Ring. Did I say the One Ring? I think I said the One Ring twice. But stops all of those. All the important things. If you stop the One Ring against Jeskai, honestly, the deck's kind of terrible. Which feels awful to say, but when they're sitting there running like Galvanic Discharges and Wrath of the Skies and whatnot, and you just have a big Murktide, you like don't care about any of that. Or if you sneak in a Frog under Counterspell, then they have such a hard time just dealing with that Frog without something like exactly Solitude. So finding like a Consign or a Force for Teferi or something like that. We usually just wrap up the game on the spot. Post board, cutting all those fatal pushes. They're pretty awful. I usually keep in the go for the throats because it's nice to have a couple answers to like a hard cast Solitude or hard cast Subtlety, Flage, something like that. Mystical Dispute is fantastic. Um, Hearse is really good. Spellbomb's good just for like stopping the whole Flage thing. Consigned to Memory. I usually won't board an extra in unless I see like Leyline Binding or something a little beyond just the one ring, you know. If they do show me Leyline Binding, then I might board in the third consign, but otherwise probably just keeping it in the sideboard. But again, it's another matchup where like Mystical Dispute is really, really good. Being able to answer a counter spell for your first threat is nice. Like, wait till turn 3, play out your frog, counter spell their Mystical Dispute, or Mystical Dispute their counter spell. You know what I mean. They're usually not playing Spell Snare, so jamming frog on turn 2 is a lot nicer. Usually it forces like a subtlety, or not a, can force a subtlety, or like a solitude pitch. And that's just like your opponent losing card advantage and getting rid of a way to deal with the Murktide. They're already limited on ways to deal with Murktide, so getting those out of hand. A thumbs up in my book. Ruby Storm. Man, I've talked about Ruby Storm so much in some of the Shadow Leagues that we've done. And if you want to see, like, this is one of my favorite matchups because I do feel like your decision making matters a lot and your knowledge of what your opponent can do matters a lot. Because there's a lot of times that it's just better to let things resolve depending on whether or not they actually matter, whether they impact the game. Certain times that you need to like jam a threat, certain times you need to hold up interaction, what kind of a threat you need to jam when. Bunch of cool nuances to the matchup. But mostly the big takeaway is the 2 CMC limitation on their deck. Everything they do that matters, 2 CMC. Ral, 2 CMC. Ruby Medallion, 2 CMC. All the rituals, Manamorphose, the Ren's Resolve effects, like all 2 CMC. So having a turn where your opponent hits their third land drop, goes for a 2 CMC card, knowing whether or not you want to spell pierce or spell snare or something right then and there. What can they follow up with? Like if my opponent resolves a Ral or casts a Ral and I've got a Fatal Push and a Spell Snare in hand, I could let them resolve the Ral, go for the Fatal Push. What if they respond to with the Ritual and just kill me? What if I hold up the Spell Snare, go for the Fatal Push, my opponent passes to their end step, I go for the Fatal Push, they respond with Ral, trigger the Ral, flip the Ral, and now I'm down a Fatal Push and they're down a Ritual. Like, how does that affect how the game's going to play out? Bunch of cool little lines like that. But really, this matchup's just about leveraging the mana advantage. We've got 1 mana interaction, Spell Snare, Pierce, Consign, to a lot of their 2 mana plays, Force a Negation, and then post board, bringing in like the extra Consign if you want it. Usually I board really minimally in the matchup, and I'll bring in like the 2 Surgicals and Nihil Spellbomb, maybe the Hearse, and just board out like a couple Go for the Throats, a Fatal Push, maybe an Archmage's Charm, something like that. You could board out a Bowmaster if you want to keep in Archmage's Charm. But just trying to bring in a couple little pieces, interact with like Past in Flames. You can also bring in a Toxic Deluge. I know it sounds really, really weird to say bring in a Toxic Deluge, but empty the Warrens. Like Ral, bunch of rituals, wish for an empty of the Warrens is absolutely a way that you can lose the matchup. So having a Toxic Deluge in your deck is not the worst thing in the world. Other than that, just like, and watch out for like a static prison off of a wish. You really need to know what variant you're playing against. If it's up against one of uh, the green red versions, Gruul. Yeah, if you're up against one of the Gruul versions, a lot more likely to have a bunch of Veil of Summers out of the sideboard. So you probably have to be more proactive about getting like a Psychic Frog down, just tapping out on turn 2, jamming it, saying, hope you don't have it, because there's a better chance that their hand is like a mana reducer, a Veil of Summer, and they might not have the necessary cards to go off. So you kind of get under that a bit with getting down a Psychic Frog. But again, some of the red-white variants, some are going to bring in a bunch of static prisons. Some are just going to keep them in the sideboard for wish. If your opponent's more likely to be keeping their answers in the sideboard, then you want to hold up your permission. If they're more likely to bring in a bunch of dead cards, and you want to jam out your threats. And that's a lot about like reading your opponent. Are they main phase fetching for a Surveil land? Are they turn 2 not doing anything and just like holding up a mana? Have they been filtering the last couple turns? Take that into account when you're deciding what you want to play. Through the Breach, or like any of the Eldrazi decks. Matchup that I think is a lot better for us than a lot of the Dimir FrogTide Discords seem to think. There's a lot of games you can steal with just like a quick Psychic Frog and a little interaction. But I do think this is a matchup where your ability to filter is so critical. What I mean by that is more often than not, game 1, you're keeping, like, I really like throwing game 1 out the window in most matchups because 9 times out of 10, your game 1 hand just like doesn't define how the matchup actually plays out. You're going to go up against Tron and see multiple Fatal Push. You're going to go up against Jeskai Control and see like double Go for the Throat. You're going to go up against Boros Energy and see double Murktide and a Force Negation, whatever. Game 1 is just like hoping somebody steals the game. So try to keep something proactive game 1 if you can, regardless of the matchup. But if you can't, it becomes filtering. Fetching out your Undercity Sewers early, using your Preordains, just trying to prevent yourself from finding things like Fatal Push and Go for the Throat, and find things like Psychic Frog, Murktide Regent, Counterspell, Force Negation instead. The 2 main deck consigns have absolutely stolen me some games against Tron in game 1. Harbinger of the Seas. I feel like there's this misconception around Harbinger in the Tron matchups where it's like windmill slam this and win the game. And people saying like, oh, it's better than Break the Ice, it's better than Consign. I think it's like the worst of the 3. And it's like Harbinger and Consign. Harbinger here, Consign a little bit higher, and I think Break the Ice is like way up high. And most of that is because once they get to, say, basic Forest, Harbinger stops mattering because you just start getting Myco Spawn, kick Myco Spawn, and they're able to kind of rebuild. We see more Tron decks running more basic Forests. Maybe they start running more Waste. Who knows? But if they're not already, they should be. Either way, Harbinger can be good if you catch them lacking or if you set up Harbinger. So countering the Talismans, Consigned to Memory, the Myco Spawn. Don't play Harbinger into your opponent having a bunch of open mana to just Kozilek's command your Harbinger. That's a big one I see a lot. Is people just saying like, okay, well, it's turn 3, slam my Harbinger. And their opponent goes, well, I'm going to float 4 mana and Kozilek's command, make 2 scions and draw a card or whatever. Untap, use my 2 colorless to kill your Harbinger with this other Kozilek's command. I see that happen way too often because people just think like they slam Harbinger and the game's over. Not the case. But like, if Harbinger is your game plan and you think it's lights out, do not let them find ways to make colorless mana. Counter the mana rocks aggressively. Force of negation, whatever you got to do. Do not let them have the mana rocks. Trinisphere, nightmare card to deal with. Counter the Trinisphere. Occasionally you'll have hands which are just like turn 1 land, they turn 1 land, you turn 2 frog, they turn 2 like soul land, cast Trinisphere, and maybe you can get away with it. Maybe you've got the 3rd land in hand, you've got to force something else, and you say, cool, I'm just going to go to my turn, play the 3rd land, hit you with the frog and draw, and now I'm going to start casting 1 counter spell every turn until the game's over. Make sure your hand is set up to do that. Don't look at it and say like, oh, well, I've got a force and a preordain and I don't know, force, preordain, another frog, a Murktide, something like that. That's not conducive to that game plan because if you use that first force the next turn, let's say they go for Kozilek's command, exile your frog, you use the force. Now your hand does not have any reactionary material. So you're locked into like hard casting a Murktide, which plays into your opponent just being able to hit you right there with like a Through the Breach or play out a Devour, exile one of your threats, and the game gets way worse for you. So if you're going to let them resolve the Trinisphere, I'd say like have 2 or 3 pieces of hard permission in your hand already and the 3rd land. Make sure you got the lands to actually cast stuff. But like a force, a consign, a counter spell in hand, and then it becomes a tempo game. Like start leveraging frog, discarding, getting in there. You might still get got by your opponent having like an end turn Kozilek's command and untap have something, but you either lose the force or you lose to Kozilek's command into something. Break the ice, like really, really great tempo play to be able to go turn 1, consign or spell pierce like a mana rock off of a soul land. Turn 2, break the ice at soul land. Turn 3, Harbinger or frog plus interaction. Really, really like that progression. So that's why I think break the ice fits in really well. If you have 3 lands and you have Harbinger out and you can't cast break the ice, you're probably winning that game because I'm assuming you have cast Harbinger in a position to where it is going to lock out the game from there. Remember that they can cast the One Ring through Harbinger, so you need to have permission for that or ways to find permission. So don't just windmill slam your Harbinger if you don't have a way to carry through with actually winning the game from there. Consign coming in, Harbinger coming in, break the ice coming in, surgical I'll come in, and a lot of times I will surgical Kozilek's command. It seems really weird. I'm bringing it in mostly because of the One Ring, but there's a lot of games where your opponent goes for an early Kozilek's command, you counter it, surgical it, and that just stops your opponent from being able to like end of turn, go for a Kozilek's command, got to fight over it, untap, play something impactful if you don't have a force negation. You kind of force them to start playing sorcery speed, which plays a lot better into your consigned to memories and force negations, counter spells, Archmage's Charm, all that stuff. So yeah, that's about it for Tron. The last 2 I'll go over. Amulet Titan. Definitely a deck you need to be fully aware of, especially if you play a lot of leagues online, because Amulet Titan is everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. seeing a lot of these new aftermath analyst lists. I do think analyst is a lot better for us game 1 because it means our spell snares aren't just dead. Game 2 and 3, you're probably boarding out the spell snares anyway, unless you just see like analyst and explorer and some other 2-drop that I don't even know, but probably not. More likely you're just boarding out spell snares completely. I wouldn't spend too much time worrying about like the shifting woodland stuff. If you are interacting with amulets, whether by force negation, spell pierce, counter spell, whatever, and getting down to threat, you can usually outrace most of that stuff. If you are really concerned about it, then you could bring in something like Hearse, but honestly, I wouldn't. Usually, Harbinger, Force, Psychic Frog / Murktide is like enough to kind of deal with a lot of that stuff. The One Ring will mess you up. Just do your best to counterspell up the ladder. Like jam a Harbinger, counterspell a One Ring, jam a Frog, force a negation and amulet, whatever you got to do to try to get some impactful threat on board. They really don't have like any good answers to Harbinger. They'll run the Forest, so they can like hard cast some stuff through Harbinger, but that's why you got counter spells. Being able to shut off any sort of like Cavern of Souls stuff is really nice. So yeah, if you got a Harbinger hand, keep a Harbinger hand. Bowmaster's not great. Spell Snare's not great. Consign is great. Harbinger's great. Break the Ice a lot of times is like a necessary bring in for me. Hitting Urza's Saga early is really nice. Not a lot of targets like Urza's Saga, Crumbling Vestige, Echoing Deeps, Handwear Battlements, Kessig Wolf Run, Mirror Pool. A lot of these like Mycosynth Gardens, a lot of these one of tutor off your Titan kind of hits. But more often than not, they're going to have 1 or 2 of those in their hand naturally as they play. So you'll probably get a chance to break the ice something. But Urza's Saga, definitely the cream of the crop target if you can hit it. Their sideboard, Sky Turtle. Looks like House of Mana was playing. That's an annoying one. Since you can't really interact with Channel like at all as an activated ability. Endurance, pretty good. Yeah, like all of our threats outgrow Endurance, so just be aware to be proactive, get attacking. That's like one of the few matchups that we are more than likely the aggressor. It's like we got to get the game over with. And then Zoo. Let's go over Zoo. What do we think about Zoo? I did mention Toxic Deluge being an out to Leyline plus Scion. If you're on the draw, that gets a little bit worse because your opponent has a chance to Scion untap with like Stubborn Denial. They're not on 4 main deck Stubborn Denial anymore, so a little bit less likely. You might just have to jam. Consign to Memory, really good against them. Hits the ETB ability off Leyline Binding. Hits ETB off Flage, attack trigger off Kavu. Most importantly, it just counters Scion of Draco, especially on the draw. So I would bring in the extra Consign to Memory. It's not even that I think Consign to Memory is like that good against the Leyline Binding aspect. It's that I think Scion of Draco is such a difficult threat to deal with. Having access to Consign on the draw just for Scion is worth it. Another one of those times, go for the throat, should be Shoot the Sheriff. So go sleeve up your Shoot the Sheriffs. Take out the go for the throats. There's a number of games that you get to like sink into Stupor, the ley line, untap, go for the throat, or not go for the throat, shoot the sheriff, the scion. Keep an eye out for that. It's like bouncing ley line a lot of times can make things a little bit awkward because they have to start fetching aggressively. They might not be able to replay the ley line, which makes future scions worse. What else? Blade is whatever. Kavu. Most of the cheap creatures, you kind of got handled okay. Either your stuff gets bigger than they do. Their red base removal doesn't really kill a lot of our stuff. Leyline Binding is where you're saving a lot of your counter spells, force and negations. Harbinger of the Seas is good. They do play a basic mountain now. They used to be basic plains, basic forest. Now they're playing a basic mountain. So you don't want to jam Harbinger of the Seas on the turn that they have a red fetch out. And also need to be aware of how the Harbinger of the Seas works with Leyline of the Guild Pact. It does make their basic a land of every type. So they Leyline of the Guild Pact and fetch out just like a basic plains or something, and you Harbinger, even if you shut off 4 other lands, that basic plains still counts as a land of every type. They can still Scion for 2, Kavu still a 5/5, Leyline Binding for 1. Just all the other lands produce blue and blue only. But that 1, still every land type. They don't really have much in the board for us, which is nice. Really just becomes Scion, Leyline Binding. If you deal with those 2, you're kind of okay. Sideboarding, Harbinger's usually coming in, and you're just trying to like pick a spot that you can jam a Harbinger and do the most amount of damage. If they get basic plains, you don't usually care too much. It's really just like basic mountain. Especially if they don't have a ley line of the Guild Pact. But even if they do have a ley line and they get a basic, there's a chance that you can win with just like, if they go into turn, try to kill your Scion, or your Harbinger, you counter it, pass the turn, they go to try to kill it on their turn, you have like a force or another counter, then you can just steal a game like that really easily by locking them out. Like once you pass the turn cycle, so I play out Harbinger on my turn, counter their kill spell, because if they've got a bunch of fetches or something in one basic, they can probably only cast 1 kill spell per turn. Like 1 on your turn, 1 on theirs. Counter the 1 on yours, pass the turn, they cast 1 on theirs, you counter it. And then once you untap back on your turn, you are extremely advantaged at that point because you more likely have the ability to either have another counter, find another counter, jam another threat, something like that. Yeah, that's about it for most of the Demir stuff. Hopefully this kind of deck tech matchup breakdown helps out if you're wanting to pick up the deck. If you want to know more, or if you want to see more gameplay, we do have videos on the channel, trophy leagues, challenges, whatnot. And who knows, maybe those will help you to go take down your own RCQ. Yeah, other than that, kind of all I got. As always, links down below to my current deck list of Demir. Link to the Twitch in case you want to come check out a live stream. Discord in case you want to come join the Cntrlfreak Discord. And Twitter so you can come see when a live stream is happening. Twitter's the first place that gets updated to let you know when that's happening. Other than that, hope y'all have a fantastic rest of your afternoon. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.